All right, so we've seen in a previous video how to take a list and traverse it and print out something like a menu. So we're starting to build up some tools to create some user interfaces, some nice interfaces that will allow us to interact and get input from users in a nice and convenient and nicely formatted way. So we learned about how to print out the menu. The other side of the coin is now how do we get in the user's choice? And that brings up the question, the kind of the larger question of what's called input validation. So when you have a program that interacts with a user, you want to make sure that the user, when you ask them for input, the user enters something that's valid. So if you ask them for a number, for example, you want to make sure they don't enter like a piece of text or a word, because somewhere down the line, that's going to cause your program to crash. And users are unreliable. You can't count on them to enter the right thing that you want them to do the very first time. Oftentimes they need a few chances or they need more explanation. So you can't count on them being perfect. And you got to build in some allowance for that. So user validation. So let's say, for example, I have a program that's going to prompt a user to enter yes or no question. So I have my input statement here, user input equals input, enter yes or no, my prompt. So if I run it, there's my prompt. Now I could enter yes, and the program would run fine. I could enter no, and the program would run fine as well. I could also enter just some gibberish, and the program just takes it. Now, what's going to happen is if I'm counting on a yes or no answer and I enter gibberish, somewhere down the line, there's going to come a point where that's going to cause the program to crash. And you don't want that to happen, obviously. So right at the point where you ask them for input, before you go on and do anything else, this would be the place where you'd want to validate that input. You want to make sure, okay, they've entered something. Let me just check to make sure, is it a yes or no? Because if it isn't, you want to, before you go on and do anything else, you want to, okay, let's do that again. You got to enter a yes or no. So you want to keep prompting them until you don't want to go on until they enter something that's valid. Otherwise, your program is going to crash. Okay, so the way we do input validation is we're going to use a loop. Now, we can't use a for loop because a for loop, you need to know in advance how many times exactly you want it to repeat. And this is a situation where we don't. The user might enter something correct the first time through, or it might take them several tries. It might take them 2, 3, 4, 5, even 6, 7 tries. So we can't count on knowing in advance how many times we need to prompt them. So we're going to use the other kind of loop, which is the while loop. The while loop. So while something is true, so while it's true that you haven't entered valid input yet, then we're going to keep asking you for input. Okay, so let's see how we would set that up. Now, in the process of doing this, I'm going to also introduce you to some other neat things about Python. Okay, so the way we'll start is before we do anything else, we're going to set up our user input variable with just a blank string. We call this an empty string, empty piece of text, nothing there, something blank. Because we haven't asked the user for input yet at this point, and we want to just set up our variable so that we can use it. So we're going to call that user input, and we're going to set that to an empty string. Okay. Now, let me introduce you to another kind of variable that we're going to use called a Boolean. Boolean, we've heard that word before. Boolean basically means true or false, yes or no, true or false. Okay, now you can assign variables to have so-called Boolean variables, Boolean values, true or false. You might think, well, what's the point of that? I mean, that doesn't seem very useful. Okay, but they're useful in situations like this where we have what's called a flag situation. So we want to be able to keep track of whether the user has entered valid input. We want to be able to flag it. We want to have some kind of indicator that tells us whether or not the input is valid. And that's a perfect scenario for using one of these so-called Boolean variables. So I'm going to make a variable called isValid. Okay, that's going to be a variable that's a flag, so-called flag, that's going to keep track of whether or not the user has entered valid data. Now I'm going to initially make it false. Okay, so now you see when I type in the word false, first of all, see it's capitalized. Capitalization is important in Python or any text-based computer language. And notice it highlights it in light blue. Okay, that means it's a special word. So you can't use it other than to assign a value to a Boolean variable, true and false. Okay, so false because at this point the user hasn't entered any input. And so is not valid because you haven't entered anything. So that's going to be my flag. So I initially going to make it false. Okay, so here's our while loop. So now we're ready. We've kind of done our setup. We've set up a couple of variables to help us. So now let's set up our while loop. So while, and I'm going to say is valid equals false. Okay, so what's going on here? So I want this loop to keep repeating. I want to keep asking the user for input as long as this is valid variable, our flag, is still false. So as long as the flag hasn't been set to true, so as long as we haven't yet come across some valid input from the user, then we want to keep asking. Remember, when we compare two things, not assigning a value, but compare things like in an if statement, or in this case, a while loop, we use the equality comparison operator, which is a double equals. So if you're comparing things to be equal, it's double equals. If you're setting one thing equal to another, then it's a single equals. Okay, so while the input is still not valid, so while is valid equals false, I'm going to have it repeat something. Okay, what do I want to have it repeat? Well, I want to have it, first of all, ask for input. So I'm going to indent that, so now it becomes a part of this loop. So while is valid equals false, so while the input is not valid, I'm going to ask them for input again. Okay, and then before I go on, before I do anything else, I need to check, once they've entered something, I'm going to need to check whether what they've entered is valid input. In other words, whether it's a yes or no. Okay, so I'm going to put a conditional. I'm going to keep it indented because I want it to be still part of this loop. I'm going to check if user input is equal to yes, or user input is equal to no. So if it's one of the valid inputs, if it's either yes or no, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip my flag. So I'm going to say at that point they've entered something valid. So I'm going to set my flag is valid equal to true. Okay, so that's my check to see once they've entered something whether that thing that they've entered is valid. If it is, then I'm going to set my flag to true so that the next time it comes around and checks it at the top of the while loop, now the condition will be not satisfied, it'll be not false, it'll be true, and then it'll go on. Okay, so then at that point it'll kick it out of the loop. We have valid input, and so it'll go on and process that input. Okay, so let's try it out. Now, let's actually do this. I'm going to put a print statement outside of the loop. So notice it's not indented, so it's no longer part of the loop. Kind of just like a marker to let us know that we've gotten through the loop. And why don't we also, while we're at it, why don't we do this? I'm going to put another print statement just to tell me what you actually entered. Okay, so I'll actually give you your input back and let you know what you entered just so we can see it working. Okay, so let's try it. Let's run it. There's my prompt, enter yes or no. Okay, so here's another lesson. So when you're testing your program, once you've got your code written, you're testing it to make sure it works. Don't just test it for one thing. So you could say, oh, okay, let's just try yes. Okay, so kicks us out of the loop. We entered something valid, kicks us out of the loop. So it prints thanks, and then it prints you entered yes. So that seems to work. Okay, but don't stop there. Don't just assume, oh, okay, I tried one case and now it works, so I'm done. We got to test it really thoroughly. So let's test no, the other option. Okay, so if I type in no, it says thanks, so it's kicked me out of the loop at that point. We know we've entered something valid, and it tells me you entered no. Still not done yet, so let's test it thoroughly. So let's run it. Let's test it with invalid input. So what if I just type gibberish? Okay, okay, so then it doesn't let me go on. It takes me back to the prompt, enter yes or no. So if I enter gibberish again, if I keep entering gibberish, it keeps prompting me. Okay, so I can go on and on and on until I enter something valid, and then it's done. Okay, so that seems to work. Okay, now here's something interesting. What if I type capital, all capital yes? It doesn't take that. Or what if I type all capital no? or capital Y-E-S, or capital N-O, or Y, or N. Okay, it doesn't take that. So it's very literal. When it says enter yes or no, it's very literal. You have to enter yes, all lowercase, or no, all lowercase. So in that sense, it's still a little bit clunky. We can fix that. We're going to learn how to fix that later on, how to make it more so-called robust, so it accepts things that obviously a human would, understand. Oh yeah, of course, you mean yes or no. But a computer doesn't quite get that because it's very literal. Okay, but this is the beginnings of it. So when you're doing input validation, often that involves looking at using, I should say, a while loop. So we start off by just setting up our variables. We have our Boolean flag variable, initially false because the user hasn't entered anything yet. Here's the main guts of it, our while loop. So while the flag is false, so as long as the input is still not valid, we keep asking. So then you ask again. You have a conditional to check whether or not it's one of our valid inputs. If it is, then you flip the flag to true so that the next time it comes around, kicks it out of the while loop, and then it says thanks, and you entered whatever. Okay, so this is input validation, important part of any program that involves user input.